All right, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, the visual elements and principles of art. A lot of times in the past, I've had students that have had a hard time understanding the difference between the elements and the principles of art. I like to use the analogy of baseball to help to explain the difference between them. So when you play baseball, there are certain things you have to have. You have to have a ball, you have to have a bat, you have to have bases, and I mean, you could do without the other stuff, but you have to have those things to play baseball. That's the visual elements. You have to have these in order to have an artwork. Most artworks combine multiples. Some may combine all of them. But the visual elements are the things you have to have in order to create art. Now, the principles that we'll see in chapter 5 are how you use those visual elements. For example, a pitcher could use the same ball, and he could throw a changeup, a slider, a fastball, a curveball, and use that in many different ways. So he's using the element of the ball with the principle of the different kinds of pitches. So maybe that will help you keep track of which is which. All right, here are the 8 or the 7 categories of visual elements. A couple of these I'm a little torn between about how they're used, because I think there's a couple of them that probably should be a principle rather than an element, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we have line, we have shape and mass, we have light, color, texture and pattern, we have space, and we have time and motion. All right, the definition that they give us for visual elements are these terms that are used as a fundamental language about the discussion of works of art. So we have line, and we have a variety of lines. We have contour lines, and we have outlines. The line is defined as a path of a moving point. We all learned that in math. You put an arrow on it, and the line goes on forever. Now, an outline defines a two-dimensional shape. And an outline is more like a silhouette than anything else. Contour lines also record not only the outline, but also define other surface ridges that you need in order to understand what that object is. I've always taught that if you think about contour lines are like color book pages. You see the outline, you've got, where the arm meets or whatever. And so color book pages are a good way to remember what contour lines are versus the outline. Okay, so the characteristics of line. Line can be made with anything. It can be made with pencil, pen, chalk, paint, marker. If you want to poke your finger and bleed, you can make a line out of that. Lines can be thick, they can be thin, they can be wavy, they can be straight, they can be at an angle, they can be zigzag. So there's all different kinds of lines that we have. Okay, here we have in Cataract 3 by Bridget Riley, who was an op artist. She uses lines in a manner that kind of fool your eye. So you can see that her lines curve. They're thick in some places, they're thin in other places. And the thickness and thinness of the lines also helps us to see where one section stops and one section starts. The other gesture drawing is just that. You're just trying to give a basic sketchy outline. And a lot of times when when artists are drawing, they'll do a quick gesture kind of sketch, and then they'll alter it to fix the outline of it to where they want it to be. Here again is an example of the difference between an outline, more like a silhouette, and contour line, which is more like a color book page. Okay, artists use lines to direct and move our eyes around a work of art. There are vertical lines, there are horizontal lines, and there are diagonal lines. And again, those can be curvy, straight, whatever. Vertical lines have the implication of growth. Things are growing up and out. Horizontal lines appear calm, like the flat calm of a lake or the ocean. And diagonal lines are dramatic. They imply that there's motion going on. This is a not so clear image of a painting called The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault, done in 1818, 1819. You can kind of see that most of the image is kind of based on an angle like this. Okay, so we've got this diagonal line going here, we've got this diagonal line going here, we've got this diagonal line going here, we've got this diagonal line going there. So we've got a lot of primarily diagonal lines, which really give the implication that this is some serious business here. Okay, there's also implied lines. Dotted lines, directional cues such as a finger pointing a certain direction, creates a line of sight that isn't actually a line, but because of the way the artist put together, you know that's a line. Okay, here's another painting, Pilgrimage to Cytherea by Jean-Antoine Watteau from 1717. If you kind of look from over here, you'll see the statue right here has an arm that's pointing this direction. So if we follow this, we follow it down to here, we follow it up and around, we're just kind of watching, going through the lines of the people, and then down the hill and over here, and notice that all the little angels are kind of going up and around, and they come back down into the mast of that ship. So this is an implied line, but it is a line nonetheless. We have shape and mass now. Shape and mass can be created by anything, line, texture, color, anything like that can create that. Shapes are two-dimensional objects. I don't like to use the term form here because I think form is more a three-dimensional. Okay, so where they use shape and mass, I would say shape and form. But mass, you know what mass is from science class. It's the amount of stuff that's in a certain space. So in that case, yes, we can think of that as a three-dimensional thing. Okay, here we have on the left, called The Dancer by Henri Matisse, done in 1949. This was during Henri Matisse's what we call cutout period, and he would cut shapes out and then reassemble them into different collages. And so you can see there that these are all flat. They're all two-dimensional objects that are then layered on top of one another to create his image. This dancer is Little Dancer of 14 Years by Edgar Degas, done in 1881. It's a bronze statue, but it has an actual fabric skirt. This one has mass to it because this is three-dimensional. Flat pieces are only two-dimensional. They have height and they have width. Forms or mass has three dimensions to it. You've got height, you've got width, and then you've got the depth going back. If you would imagine taking this piece, and if you turned it around, all you're going to see is the back of the canvas. You're not going to see this image on the back of it. Whereas here, as you would move around the sculpture, you would see different angles, you would see different portions of it. So when I go around and I go to the back side of this, I'm seeing the back of the dancer, not the back of a piece of canvas, a flat piece of canvas. All right, we've got a couple of broad categories for shapes, okay? I'm not going to worry about masses for right now, but shapes come in two forms. They come in organic and they come in geometric forms. A geometric form is anything you can put a name to it. A circle, a square, a triangle, a rhomba, whatever. And they are created by mathematical formulas. Organic shapes are irregular, more natural. Like in the picture of Henri Matisse, the pieces that look like palm fronds, okay, that would be an organic shape. Okay, here's some examples of pieces of artwork that are done with geometric versus organic shapes. So on the left, we have Broadway Boogie Woogie by Piet Mondrian, 1942 and 43. If you'll notice, his artwork is all lines and shapes and color. So he has a lot of vertical lines. He's got a lot of horizontal lines. Those vertical and horizontal lines then create different squares and rectangles and things like that. Composition 7 by Vasily Kandinsky has all kinds of organic shapes. In some cases, you might find something that you think kind of looks like something, but for the most part, the shapes are, you couldn't put a name to them. You know, you don't have a circle, you don't have a square, you don't have a rectangle in that piece. So it is primarily made up of organic shapes. Okay, now we talk about the figure and the ground, and that's where we get into positive and negative shapes. The positive shape of any artwork is the figure itself, and the negative shape is always whatever the background is. Here's an example of positive versus negative shapes. On the left-hand side, you have a white form as the positive shape, the black as the background or the negative space. On the other side, you have the black as the positive shape, that's the object, and you have white, which is the negative space or the background. All right, now we're talking about light. Light is required to show us the illusion of form. If you have value changes that will create the illusion of forms, you have to have light. If you went to the back of Meramec Caverns and they turn the light out, you can't see your hand in front of your face. You cannot see anything unless you have light. If there's a little bit of light, you can start to see outlines and things like that. But light helps us to see objects. It also helps us see shadows and value changes and things like that as we get into those. All right, the figure on the left, a black box, that would be an object that has no light at all. So it's just a black box. The sculpture that's on the right-hand side is, it has light on it, so we can see different values. We can see lighter areas, we can see darker areas, we can see changes in color, the lights and darks on the forms that help us see that those are actually, it's the illusion of 3 dimensions. All right, we have 2 kinds of light. You have actual light and you have illusionistic light. Actual light would be existing light. If you have your form, you've got your sculpture sitting there, and you've got a light shining on it, and that's creating the different values and see the different where one object starts and the other stops. Illusionistic light is well, I call it a part of a little toolkit. Art, two-dimensional art, is all about illusion. You have this magic part of, and illusionistic light is the illusion or impression of light that's created whenever we do any kind of artwork. We're giving the illusion that there is light in the artwork somehow, somewhat. Several techniques that artists use to give the illusion that there is light within the work of art and that it's giving the illusion that flat objects have 3 dimensions. You've got shading and modeling, value, and chiaroscuro, which is an Italian term. Shading and modeling is done with value changes or chiaroscuro. The shading and modeling is what you use to create 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional plane. The term value means the light or darkness of a particular color. So if we were talking about, let's say, the color red, you could have red, and all of the lighter reds would go up to pink. All of the darker reds would go to a deep dark maroon. And all of those values in between would be ways that an artist could create the modeling or the illusion of the form. The chiaroscuro is the contrast of lights and shadows. This term really became important around the time of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. All of those artists worked they worked with forms so much, and how light would hit objects and how light created the dimension, and they became so good at it that they pretty much set the benchmark for how do you deal with, making a flat plane look like it has 3 dimensions. Here are 2 artworks by Leonardo da Vinci. The one on the left is a part of the angel from Madonna of the Rocks. And on the right, obviously, Mona Lisa. Everybody knows her. The way they were able to get this subtle modeling, the face is a really difficult part of the body to shade correctly and use value correctly. But Leonardo da Vinci, he's actually studied anatomy to see how the muscles laid under the skin and those kinds of things in order to create these very, very subtle changes from light to dark. There are several, I call them shading techniques rather than value techniques, but it would work either way, that artists can use to imply that there is light in a piece of artwork, that there is that change from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional type of object. So we've got hatching, which are closely spaced parallel lines, cross hatching, parallel lines intersecting, and stippling, dots. Here we see lines and dots used to create value changes. Now, these kinds of shading techniques or value techniques really work well when you are using a medium that you cannot control by pressure. So a pencil, you can make it darker just by pressing harder. Well, things like markers, ink, those kinds of things they're the same thing when it comes out. You can't make those lighter or darker by pressure. You can do it by making lines of those things. So if you took a marker and you just started doing hatch lines, the idea is the closer together they are, the more of them they are, the darker it's going to be. And then the further apart the lines are, and the fewer lines there are, the lighter it's going to look. And then the same thing with the stippling. So these are great if people are doing just black and white work or whatever, markers, ink, those kinds of things. Color theory. There's all kinds of stuff about color theory, print color versus light and all of that. But what we're going to concentrate on is the traditional color wheel. The color wheel is based on refracted colors that Sir Isaac Newton saw when light was directed through a prism. Okay, you have three primary colors: red, yellow, blue. All the other colors are made from red, yellow, blue. We call them primary colors because you can't mix anything to get those colors. You have to start with them. Secondary colors are colors that are made by mixing two primary. So if you mix red and yellow together, you're going to get orange. If you mix yellow and blue, you're going to get green. Blue and red, you're going to get violet. And we use violet, the term violet instead of purple because it sounds better. Then you have tertiary, intermediate colors, third stage colors that are made by mixing a secondary with a primary. So we have yellow and orange is yellow orange, orange and red is red orange. We always use the primary name first because there's more of that in there than there's more red in red orange than there is orange. So red and red violet, no. Red and violet is red violet, violet and blue is blue violet, blue and green is blue green, green and yellow is yellow green. Color properties are also important to understand. The hue is the name of the color: red, orange, purple, green, chartreuse, lime, whatever. The value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. And that's where we said, like with a pencil, you've got everything from the darkest, almost black that you can get with a pencil, all the way to basically white, and all of those values in between. Using each one of those values will help make a flat object look like it's three-dimensional. The saturation, the chroma, is the purity of a color. With saturation, if you mix two complementary colors, those are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel, it will start to dull them down. Okay, so it's how dull your colors are going to be. So at this point, you've got your red here, you've got, I guess this is a gray, and then as you mix them together, you're putting red into the gray and you're putting gray into the red, and it's gradually getting mixed more. The saturation is how much of the actual color you got in there, whether it's got anything else mixed with it. All right, so the next thing would be to talk about some color schemes. Color schemes are colors that go together for specific reasons. For example, here are warm colors. Those are the colors located on the red and yellow and orange side. So red, red, orange, orange, yellow, orange, yellow. We call those warm colors because they remind us of warm things, the sun, fire, etc. Cool colors are located on the other side. So yellow, green, green, blue, all the way over to red, violet. The yellow, green, and the red, violet kind of can cross one way or the other. But we think of these as cool colors because they remind us of cool things. Water, ice, grass, the sky, those kinds of things. When you add white to a pigmented color, when you add white to any color, you get a tint of the color. And that's T-I-N-T, not T-E-N-T. And to get a shade, you add black to the color. Now, I have had people in the past that think that tint is adding black to a color because they think of things like tinted windows on a car. Well, that isn't the case. If you think more of shade, okay, when you walk into the shade, things get darker. So in order to get things darker, you have to add black to it. Right, there are basically two kinds of color. And it is a little bit different whether you're working with light or whether you're working with pigment. When you're working with light, additive colors mean the more colors you add to it, you're going to get lighter colors. So by the time you mix all of those colors together, like here, all of those, you're going to get white. You're going to get white light because remember, white light, when you shoot it through a prism, breaks out into all of those different colorways. On the other hand, when we're working with pigment, it's more subtractive color. So pigments of different hues, when you mix them together, it's just going to get darker and duller. Okay, again, we talked color scheme, warm, cool. We also have what we call monochromatic. And if you want to break that down, the term mono here means one, and the chroma means color. So a monochromatic color scheme is one color with all of its tints and shades, so all the variations of the same hue. Complementary colors are colors that are directly opposite each other on the color wheel. Red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple. Analogous colors are colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. So blue, green, green, yellow, green, or red, red, violet, violet. Any colors that are next to each other. And triads are colors that are equidistant on the color wheel. So your primary colors are triadic. Your secondary colors are triadic. You could probably figure that out with any of them. As long as you put the same, distance in there, you can have a triad. All right, color can also be used to create optical effects, just like the Bridget Riley example, where the black lines were curved and they were further apart in some places and they were closer together in others, and how that created a value change that made it look like the paper was rippling. The brain also has these wonderful optical after effects. If you stare at this dot for any length of time, I say 10 seconds, and then you go and you stare at this dot, you're going to see an after image, is what they call it. And the circle then that you see around this is going to be the complementary color of whatever this one was. So the complementary color of red is green. So when I stare at that and I go to look at this, I see a green circle around the around that black dot. We talked before about the invention of the camera and how that actually allowed artists to experiment with different techniques, with different ways of creating images. So pointillism is a technique where you apply dots of pure color that our eyes mix on its own. and they call that an optical color mixture. The brain is a wonderful thing, and you could take a dot or a splash of red and a splash of yellow and put that next to them. When you back up from it, your eyes are going to see the illusion of orange. And pointillism is similar to the stippling, except that you're using dots of color to create. Here are a couple of examples of pointillism. This one on the left here is much clearer. You can see how you can use multiple colors together. You can use all of a single color and just put the dots closer together or further apart. You have to have the dots close enough together so that you can see what color the object is, but it can work the other way as well. This particular painting, Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, this hangs in the Chicago Art Museum, and it's huge, it's big, and this entire thing is done with dots of color. There have been a lot of studies done on color and how they affect us. Color is, they affect us on such a basic level, our emotions, our moods, and things like that. Different colors are more culturally accepted depending on where you are in the world. Maybe the colors that you are most familiar with and affect you the most are natural colors because you use natural items in order to create dyes or whatever. Or, here there's an endless number of items that we can get an endless amount of stuff in that color. So the kinds of colors that artists use is going to evoke some sort of a response in us. The work on the right is The Scream by Edvard Munch. The one on the, sorry, that's the one on the left. The one on the right is The Old Guitarist by Pablo Picasso. Now, looking at the different color schemes that are being used, here we have a lot of bright colors, and it's the lines that are being made with those colors creates a little bit of chaos. And then you have this figure in the front who is screaming, and you kind of feel that there's a turmoil going on there. You've got the red, oranges and the blues, complementary colors that are creating this anxiety of sorts. When you look at The Old Guitarist, this is in almost a monochromatic color scheme, with the exception of the guitar. It's all different shades of blues, and blues are more calming. They are, blue is a great color in a bedroom if you want a restful sleep. If you've got a child that has ADHD, you definitely don't want to paint their room red because that's an agitating kind of color. Now, here's a place where I personally disagree with the way they have the elements and principles of art put together. I don't believe that pattern is an element. I believe pattern is a principle because it is a way of using other things. Texture is anything that you can touch. It's tactile. If it's a real object, you can feel smooth, rough, soft. If you are drawing a piece or analyzing a piece of artwork and it's a two-dimensional piece, there are certain kinds of repeated elements that you can put in to imply that something is soft or hard or scratchy or whatever. Pattern is a repetition, and it can be a repetition. You can have a pattern in color. You can have a pattern in line. You can have a pattern in shape. You can have a lot of patterns. So, I mean, they've got texture and pattern kind of lumped together. But pattern can be used to imply texture. And I guess maybe that's where they're going with it. But so actual texture is something you can actually feel. Implied texture is an illusion. Okay, it's making that bunny that you drew look like a nice soft bunny. And anything that's repetitive is a pattern. The repetition can be color, it can be line, it can be shape, it can be anything like that. So these are some examples of actual texture versus implied texture. This horse is made out of wire. Deborah Butterfield did multiple three-dimensional horses out of lots of different kinds of materials. This one happens to be wire. And so if you run your hand over that, you're going to feel the wire. Now, implied texture is when you're trying to pretend that something that doesn't have texture, doesn't actually have texture, has texture. So here we've got the kind of lines and patterns that you would use if you wanted to imply that something was wood. This could be leaves wrapped around things. Here you've got something that looks a little bit like stone. Here you've got something that looks like pebbles. Here you've got lines that are used to make grass or fur, something that looks fuzzy and soft rather than hard. And here again is pattern, which again, I already said I don't agree with where they put it. But pattern is using any element of art repetitive, whether it be in fabric. This is not a super clear picture, but you can see in fabric, we have a lot of different patterns. Here they are taking different areas of this wave design, and within each of the sections there is some sort of a line design that is repeated over and over, whether it's these teardrop shapes or these fan shapes or the bubbles or scale looking things. Anytime you're repeating something over and over and over again, it is a pattern. All right, so space is that third dimension. So space, when you are looking at a sculpture is three-dimensional and it takes up space. It has height, width, and depth. Other kinds of space, you are giving the illusion that there's three dimensions on a two-dimensional plane. So that could be negative and positive. You could also overlap objects, make things look like there's something behind something else, making things that are in a distance smaller. That helps to create that illusion, and so does perspective. Here we see sand sculptures, and we see a marble sculpture done by Michelangelo. All sculpture is three-dimensional. You can walk all the way around the artwork and you can see all different views of it. All sculpture is three-dimensional. All sculpture is considered to be form. Two-dimensional artwork can only have the illusion of having form. Here's form that's created by using perspective. It's also used with hatching, cross-hatching lines in order to make some areas look darker than others. Here, this form is created by making value changes, and in this case, it's by pressure changes. So with a pencil, you could press really dark to get these dark areas, and then use it very lightly to get these kind of areas. Some other illusionistic art techniques. Foreshortening is where you're using the application of perspective in order to do human form. An atmospheric perspective is a color base. So as objects are further back from you, they're paler, they're bluer, they're less distinct. Blue, cool colors recede, warm colors pop towards you. Foreshortening is one of the most difficult aspects of art. You really have to work at it. Here you see where there's a specific proportion usually to the human body. When you're trying to do it in foreshortened method, those proportions go out the door. It's the same thing if you're looking at a ballet dancer and one foot they're in a stance and one foot is going off to the side and one foot is coming straight at you. Those are unique things that you have to work with, but it is a way of creating that illusion that there's three dimensions here. Atmospheric perspective, this is a really good example of that. See, as you go back, things get cloudier. They are not as detailed, and things tend to get bluer the further back you go. Illusionistic perspective is, or illusionistic space, is a technique used primarily in China in Islamic paintings. And they do that so that you can see the entire painting. If this painting over here was done with true linear perspective, some things would probably be hidden by whatever's in front of them. But by using this method, you can see pretty much everything. Yeah, there are still people that are overlapping other people, but they're not completely hidden. So time and motion are some fairly new emphasis in the art world. There's more thought and emphasis placed on the nature of time. Kinetic art, sculptural kinetic art, is art that actually moves. A baby's mobile over a baby bed. The term mobile was actually coined by Alexander Calder, who did, these are on the right hand side, these are called stabiles because they have a stable base. But Alexander Calder designed these things so that they are perfectly balanced and they will move. This is going to spin, and all of these things spin on all of these pivot points. And so the entire thing moves, and it can move with the smallest of a breeze. So to sum it up, and I know we didn't spend much time, you could spend a great deal more time on all of these elements, but knowing the basics of them is enough for art appreciation. So we have line, contour, and outline lines. We have shape and mass. So we've got geometric or organic shape. You have figures and ground, which is the positive, negative shape kind of thing. With light, you've got value, modeling, chiaroscuro, stippling, hatching, and cross-hatching. All different ways to create the illusion of light in an area. With color, we have reflected and refracted light. Hue, which is the pure color. Value, intensity, tint, shade, monochromatic, complementary, analogous, triadic, simultaneous, contrast, after image, pointillism. All of those can be lumped under color.
Texture and pattern, you basically have two kinds. You have actual pattern or actual texture or visual simulated texture. To create space in a picture plane, you have perspective, linear 1.2 point, atmospheric, isometric, and you have foreshortening. And then time and motion, which really works with the kinetic arts. So this is pretty much all of our visual elements. Don't know how far we'll actually get. We'll probably take a little bit of time on Wednesday and we'll go back through all of these. And then I'll have something for you to do that's based on the elements of art and how those are worked into artworks.